So now, by the middle of the 17th century, English colonists have settled two regions. One is the Chesapeake, and the other is New England. And we've talked about some looming problems on the horizon. In the Chesapeake, there's a problem where indentured servants or recently freed indentured servants feel like their interests are being ignored. And to be honest, they're not wrong. On the other hand, we've also talked about the fact that the religious mission in Massachusetts Bay has kind of lost focus with the Halfway Covenant and a few religious controversies. And now all of those problems will explode in two separate but simultaneous events. We have King Philip's War in New England, and we also have Bacon's Rebellion in the Chesapeake area. This is one of the first major events you have to know because, look, I mean, colonial American history is a lot of demographic stuff. It's, the history of certain processes, right? Slowly but surely, hundreds, if not thousands of people are migrating from England to the colonies. But these are major events, and they're important because of what they do during the time period, but they're even more important because of their lingering effects afterwards. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in New England first. So the first issue is that remember that the Puritans were kind of different in that they didn't have actively homicidal attitudes towards the Native Americans, but there were still lingering problems. For one, Puritans had very different views on property than Native Americans. Remember, the more property you had, the more likely you were going to be seen as a member of the elect. And also, even though the Puritans weren't interested in growing cash crops, they were interested in farming and protecting their land, and they wanted to use their land for exclusive use. Native Americans in general just don't have a concept of property. And, if you think about it, property is kind of a weird thing, that this object is just intrinsically tied to you, that you control it, and only you can exercise dominion over that thing. Generally, property, or the idea of property, emerges because of scarcity. So, for example, if I have 1,000,000 acres of land and you have 1,000,000 acres of land, and I'm only able to use maybe a few acres, and then I hear that you have crossed over into my property. Okay, you basically put a toe on my property. I'm probably not going to be all that angry with you. And maybe that's because I'm a really chillax guy. I don't know. But I think it's also just because, so what? There's more land than I can feasibly use. So why am I going to be upset over the fact that you are, on, quote, my property, unquote? And so for the small tribes that sort of surrounded Massachusetts Bay, the thing is that they've always enjoyed more land than they could actually use. Small populations that control a lot of territory. So most land, there's this concept of tribal hunting grounds. And there's also this concept that, certain land is going to be more useful for production of food. But there isn't a concept that, an individual can exercise exclusive control over a piece of land or property. And remember, the Puritans, coming from overcrowded England, have the exact opposite view, that property is something almost sacred. And the more that you have, the more that signifies your status as a member of the elect. There are also religious differences, and we've kind of talked about some of those religious differences. The Puritans did believe in general that Native Americans were inferior, but they also believed that it was their duty to save them and convert them to to Puritan Christianity. So in that respect, they're kind of similar to the Spanish. They don't really intermix with the Native Americans like the Spanish do, but there is this idea that Native Americans are still, children of God. That being said, we talked about the fact that in animistic religions, there really isn't this concept of exclusivity, right? So the Christian God is just another great spirit. It may be a very powerful great spirit because one of the things that happens is that for many Native American tribes, once they slowly but surely get pushed out of their hunting grounds, once their population is reduced because of smallpox and other diseases, there are some religious consequences where they doubt the power and abilities of their own spirits and gods. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they all convert wholesale and sort of exclusively worship or venerate the Christian God. So what happens is that many Puritan religious leaders travel out into the West to set up religious centers for Native Americans. They're called praying towns, by the way. And the thing about praying towns is that praying towns are not just interested in discussing theology, because to the Puritans, remember that is not enough to necessarily believe in God. You have to also signify your membership as being part of the elect. So members of the elect don't subsist on hunting. Members of the elect own their own property and farm. So what happens is that these praying towns are not only trying to force Native Americans to convert religiously, but also culturally. They were expected to basically abandon their lifestyle, abandon their tribe, and basically raise small nuclear families on farms. And by the way, that's not going to be the last time we talk about those efforts. You're going to see another problem in the 1880s, believe it or not, when Americans basically try to do the same thing, force Native Americans in the Great Plains to basically assimilate and become almost like white farmers. So what also happens, though, is that there are clear military differences. So Puritans were kind of contemptuous of the way Native Americans fought, because the way warfare worked between Native Americans is, okay, let me back up, is not the case that Native Americans were inherently more peaceful than Europeans. Native American tribes fought constantly with one another, but they fought constantly in low intensity warfare. So in other words, Native American warfare generally involved one tribe's, group of warriors, maybe just like a dozen or so, fighting another tribe's group of warriors, and the winner of that fight wins the war. And they might be entitled to take captives or prisoners, but the goal wasn't to conquer another tribe, really. The goal is to basically force another tribe to acknowledge your greatness and for them to give you stuff. So that's the way Native Americans kind of view warfare, as something that's small scale and something that's fought by, tribal warriors, by people who kind of spend their time training to fight. And Puritans were kind of dismissive over this because they saw that as really indecisive. And the fact that Native Americans like to fight with not just spears, but also with bows and arrows. And they also, by the way, liked to skulk. That was the Puritan word for it. Basically, skulking means that, they didn't just stand there and wait to be attacked. If somebody was shooting at them, they would hide behind trees and rocks. So apparently the Puritans were not at all about self-preservation, but in another way they were. Because contrast the way Native Americans fought from the way Puritans fought. So Europeans generally, let's say they had smaller numbers of wars, but those wars were bigger. Because for Native Americans, if they really lose a conflict, they can always go somewhere else. I mean, and that's not super convenient, but at the same time, you have that option because there's more land than you have people to really use that land. The thing is, guys, that if Switzerland loses a war, Switzerland can't really uproot and go somewhere else. So warfare in Europe was, let's say, more intermittent. It didn't happen constantly, but when war did happen, it was big war, not small war. And the other thing is, I mean, that kind of applies for almost all Europeans, but it especially applies to the Puritans because not only are the Puritans bringing European tactics with them, they're also bringing with them this whole notion that they are a persecuted people. One of actually the most widely read book during this time period was not the King James Version of the Bible. The most widely read book during this time period was Fox's Book of Martyrs, which basically is exactly what you think is about. Fox's Book of Martyrs talks about the special destiny of England and the fact that the history of England and the history of Protestant Christianity itself is about people taking a stand and defending their faith. And the fact that England has a special, almost divine mission to protect Protestant Christianity. So, in other words, if the Puritans go to war, believe it or not, they're not going to be pushovers. And so what happens is that in 1637, there is a war that breaks out between the Pequot tribe and the Puritans and their Native American allies. And what happens is that the Wampanoag, by the way, the allies of the Puritans, they believe that this war between the Puritans and the Pequot is going to be a small-scale war that involves, maybe a few skirmishes, maybe a few people getting killed and wounded, but at the end, there will be negotiations and an exchange of captives. What actually happens, though, is that in 1637, when this conflict breaks out, the Puritans mobilize, they surround the Pequot village, and they kill every single person. Hundreds of Native Americans are killed. And the Wampanoag are like, guys, what just happened? I mean, there's really no precedent for this. I mean, even the Aztecs generally were more interested in capturing people. But to the Puritan mindset, the Pequot were treacherous. This war, by the way, between the Pequot begins because the Pequot are accused of harboring a fugitive that killed a Puritan trader. Trader, by the way. And then this escalates, and then that results in the Pequot being wiped out. So we've mentioned that many Native American tribes view the Europeans just like another tribe. There's not a concept of the Europeans as being somehow different. But at this point, this is where even the allies of the Puritans begin to understand that fundamentally the Puritans are different from other tribes. Other tribes don't fight like this. And so in 1676, a chief of the Wampanoag, a chief by the name of Metacom, also known as King Philip by the Puritans, strikes back. And in this kind of like this surprise attack, actually, King Philip leads his warriors and they attack these praying town settlements, partially because there's now this thought that the Europeans aren't just interested in trading with Native Americans. They want to actively destroy the local culture. So the way this works is that at first, King Philip's War is very successful for the Wampanoag and their allies. Actually, the Wampanoag bring in a lot of other neighboring tribes. From the Puritan perspective, they think that this is treason, right? The Wampanoag are allies and now they're not. From the Wampanoag perspective, this has kind of been a long time coming. So at first, again, the Wampanoag are able to use their knowledge of the terrain and their superior military skills to actually give the Puritans a run for their money. If the Puritans had been another Native American tribe, they would be expected at this point to throw in the towel. But as you might expect, if you throw in the towel, well, maybe you're not a member of the elect. So what happens is that the Puritans hunker down for a little bit and just play a waiting game. And eventually what happens is that the Wampanoag, who are actually using gunpowder-based weaponry, they run out of ammunition. Because remember, once you adopt European gunpowder-style weapons, not only do you need the weapons, you need the ammunition, and they run out. And it's at that point that the Puritans slowly but surely fight back. Interestingly, many of the Puritans actually have to grudgingly adopt Native American tactics. And the war itself you could argue, was started by Native Americans, but also won by Native Americans. Because ultimately, it's the Praying Town Indians, as they were called, that win the war for the Puritans. Metacom himself is actually killed by one of these Praying Town Indians. But even though the war is very, very short, it's incredibly destructive. So the results of King Philip's War were extremely significant. So remember that in the Chesapeake, you have a war between the settlers and Powhatan's Confederation in about the year 1625, and that actually bankrupted the Virginia Company. Similarly, the Puritans have to bite the bullet and actually go back to Mommy England for help. And as a consequence, they become politically and militarily indebted to England. And I mean, just imagine what a blow to the Puritan ego that was. So you're trying to create a city on a hill to inspire the English to adopt the Puritan faith. And in fact, what happens is they actually have to come crawling back, practically on their hands and knees, to beg the English for help. So this war debt, along with the destruction of King Philip's War, leads to an economic contraction. Two, you have hatred for the Native Americans. And, what's, for some of you, especially if you're looking backwards in time, that's not all that surprising, because we've talked about a lot of hatred for Native Americans on the part of Europeans. But remember that the Puritans had a condescending view of Native Americans, but it wasn't a view that really crossed into hate. They still tried to convert them to Christianity, and they still believed that they could basically be assimilated into English colonial society. And certainly there probably was some degree of hatred for Native Americans, but it wasn't something that was widely felt until now. Because remember that Metacom, or King Philip, was supposed to be an ally of the Puritans, and he betrayed. I think that most people, or at least a lot of people, could see that coming. But remember, the Puritans are, have this very ideological view of the world. And so the fact that they're assimilating neighboring tribes and basically forcing them to kind of become English people, the Puritans think they're doing them a favor. They can't imagine that this would actually be a source of contention So there is this, let's say, more negative attitude for Native Americans after the war itself. Um, the other thing is that for really the next generation, the expansion of Massachusettsians westward is going to be stalled. Basically, King Philip's War pushes the frontier back. And basically, in the war itself, the Puritans lose over 12 villages and anywhere between 600 to 1,000 people. Native American losses were about 3,000, or about 25% of the Native American population in southern New England. So, just for some perspective, the Soviet Union during the Second World War had a really rough war, and it only lost 15% of its population in that conflict. So the war for both the New English and the Native Americans was devastating. But now there's also this developing idea that Europeans and Native Americans are different because when the chips are down, European colonies might squabble, right? There's no love lost, for example, between Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay, and especially no love lost between Massachusetts Bay and England. But when the chips are down, they'll still kind of band together and fight Native Americans. And the same thing can't be said about Native Americans, where historically, whether you're looking at Massachusetts Bay or Virginia, or even the Spanish conquest of Mexico itself, Europeans have always been able to play Native Americans off against each other. Um, that is going to be less the case from this moment forward. And in King Philip's War, we kind of see this like a pattern that you're going to see repeat throughout this course. For right now, we're talking about King Philip's War, but we're going to talk about other conflicts with between white settlers and Native Americans. We're going to talk about Pontiac's Rebellion. We're going to talk about the war between Tecumseh and Western settlers. We're going to talk about the war against the Sioux and the Ghost Dance movement. The wars change, the locations change, the time periods change, but the same pattern you see in King Philip's War is going to repeat. That there is some kind of Native American leader or group of leaders that emerge that call for cultural and religious revival. And that's something that we definitely see in King Philip's War. So the other consequence, though, goes back to the war debt. So King Philip's War is kind of that moment where, like, imagine that the Puritans are kind of like teenagers upstairs in their room, and then King Philip's War is this loud crash that reverberates around the house and startles your mom. And your mom is England, and your mom shouts, "What's going on up there?" So from this point onward, the English government is going to be more involved in colonial affairs, especially as New England is concerned, and Massachusetts specifically. So we're going to talk a little bit about English history here. And it's actually going to be very, very significant and very relevant. Because last time we talked about England becoming a city upon a hill, where the government was overthrown by Parliament with the aid of Puritan factions led by a military commander by the name of Oliver Cromwell. There is this brief period of military dictatorship in England, and apparently there's this consensus after Cromwell dies that that dictatorship was nothing to write home about. Basically, England was divided into military districts, and each district was ruled by major generals. It's one of the only time periods, actually it is the only time in English history since, I don't know, maybe the time of Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain, where the military actually rules England directly. So one of the things that Cromwell did is he outlawed dancing, gambling, and Christmas. I know that some of you have heard of a figurative war on Christmas, but Oliver Cromwell fought an actual war on Christmas. So if you're somebody who actually outlaws Christmas, I'm willing to bet that you're not going to be super popular. And Cromwell wasn't. And so even some of his Puritan allies started thinking about asking for the return of the Stuart dynasty, the same dynasty that King James I, King Charles I, and his son King Charles II were part of. So, this period is called the Restoration, which happens in about 1660. And from that point, the English again start to focus a little bit more on colonial affairs. And remember, the war itself had created a lot of debt, and the English started scrutinizing let's say, the original charter of Massachusetts Bay. And remember back when I said that the English would use any opportunity to basically revoke that original charter. Well, that's basically what happens, because as they are reviewing the original charter, they find an error. They basically argue that the original charter was incomplete because it wasn't delivered. Get this, it wasn't delivered to the right people at the right time. So because of a clerical error, the Crown orders the charter of Massachusetts Bay revoked. And instead what happens is that Massachusetts Bay, along with basically all the other New English colonies, they all get incorporated and ruled as the Dominion of New England. And by the way, just look at how expansive this is. You have Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, you've got parts of New York. And this was a colony that was going to be ruled by a royal governor, where the official religion would be the Church of England. Now, you talk about going from the city on a hill to practically not even being a city anymore, right? You're now just part of this weird thing called the Dominion of New England. And the thing is that this, there are certainly a lot of Puritans here, but in New York you have Dutch settlers, there are lots of Scotch and actually Swedish settlers in New Jersey. In other words, this seems calculated so that the colony will lose its Puritan character. And if that's not bad enough, in 1684, the General Court of Massachusetts was prevented from meeting at all. So, remember that the Puritans wanted to purify the Anglican Church because apparently it was seen as too Catholic. So the Anglican Church was Protestant, but it was just too Catholic for Puritans. So think about this. If that's how the Puritans feel about people who act like Catholics, how are they actually going to feel about actual Catholics? Well, the individual who is responsible for administering the Dominion of New England is King Charles II's brother, James, who is an open Catholic. Ooh. So, King Charles II dies in 1685. And despite the large number of mistresses he had, for whatever reason, he failed to produce a male heir who would succeed him on the throne. So the throne goes to, you guessed it, the governor, or at least the leader of the Dominion of New England, and now the King of England, King James II. And again, King James II is not just, a nominal Catholic, he's like super Catholic. And not only did this upset the Puritans, it upset even let's say, moderate Anglicans. It sort of, let's say, alienated sort of secular Anglicans, because here's something to understand about, um, let's say, the English political system. Some of you are probably familiar with the fact that we as Americans are a little touchy about communism. We sort of are paranoid about communists and communist conspiracies. Basically, the English feel about Catholics the way Americans feel about communists. And in some respects, the arguments they raise are kind of similar. The idea, or the argument raised against communism, was the idea that you have all of these communist groups that are secretly under the control of the Soviet Union. In other words, you have these communists who are conspiring with a foreign power against the United States. Similarly, the argument was that Catholics aren't really loyal to the nation, they're loyal to the Pope. And they'll put that loyalty before anything else. And in James's case, that's really not the way it worked. In some respects, he kind of ruled just like any other king of England would rule. But Parliament met with James II and basically gave him an ultimatum that they would approve his coronation, his accession to the throne, if he would make sure that the throne would go to a Protestant. So his daughter, Mary, was a Protestant and married to the unofficial leader of the Protestant world, basically Prince William of Orange, who was a Dutch prince. But at this point, there's this kind of uneasy truce. In 1685, when Charles actually ascends to the throne. But then James II does the unthinkable. He actually fathers a male heir, and he makes it known that he will raise that heir as a good Catholic. So, at that point, the English government decides, actually, basically, members of Parliament, the Royal Navy, they get together and plot an overthrow of King James II. And it's not just a coup d'etat, it's not just a revolution, it's called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And eventually, the James's daughter, Mary, and her husband William become joint rulers of England. Must have made family reunions really awkward. Hey, Dad, sorry that I kind of helped overthrow you. How's the potato salad? But eventually, when Mary and William die and the throne sort of passes along lines of succession, the throne is eventually passed to a bunch of Germans who don't actually speak any English. That includes George I and George II. Nobody really remembers those Georges, but everybody is aware of their rather more famous descendant, George III. But to the English, that's okay, because even though the Georges didn't speak English, they're at least Protestant. So just think about that and what that means. The English would rather have non-English speaking Protestant Germans as kings rather than English speaking Catholics. That's just how ingrained that prejudice is. And by the way, that prejudice crosses the Atlantic too. And so there's a lot of anti-Catholic bigotry in U.S. history, and that's also kind of where it gets its start from our, let's say, English ancestors, I suppose. So you have a glorious revolution in 1688, but you also, interestingly, have a revolution or you could say a revolt, but let's say a disturbance in 1689. King James II delegates Edmund Andros as the governor of the Dominion of New England. Andros is in a difficult position because he has a very diverse colony that he's ruling. But the Puritan Church lost its special status. And of course, there's this fear of let's say, of having a Catholic king on the throne. So in 1689, Andros, who is again not the most popular governor, is actually overthrown. Fortunately for the Puritans, little did they know, but they sort of get off scot-free because just slightly before this, the English have their Glorious Revolution, and so the Puritans don't exactly get punished for their small revolution in Boston. So at this point, the Dominion of New England is dissolved. And instead, what happens is that Massachusetts is reincorporated, but it's reincorporated as a royal colony with a royal governor. So, in other words, even though the revolt in Boston was kind of this really significant moment where Puritans come together and assert their identity, on the downside, the colony of Massachusetts Bay doesn't really get back its Puritan status because it comes back as a royal colony with a royal governor. So next time, we'll move back down south and talk about the Chesapeake and another rebellion that happens then. See you guys.